Welcome to this session on using assessment as a tool for equity inclusion. My name is Gavin Henning. I'm Program Director for the Masters of Higher Education Program and Doctor of Education Program at New England College, where I'm also a Professor of Higher Education, and my pronouns are he, him, and his.
And I'm Ann Lundquist. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Campus Strategy at Campus Labs and former Director of Assessment and Strategic Planning at Western Michigan University. And I use she, her, hers.
And we want to acknowledge at the beginning of the session that we realize that we have and both Ann and I have a lot of privileged identities that we bring to this, but we also feel this is responsibility as being white individuals to really talk about equity and to use that privilege to make some change. So as we start this session, we want to talk a little bit about the context. So first of all, this has been an evolving conversation. I think, Ann, we probably started this a couple of years ago, probably, at the NASPA conference talking about this idea, but it was really jump-started by the paper by Eric Montenegro and Natasha Jankowski about culturally responsive assessment. And Ann and I just began talking about that a little bit further and began wondering, are there multiple areas or multiple elements of this work? And we began talking about that. And we figured if we really wanted to make an impact in the field, we really needed to bring some other partners in. And so we collaborated and created the Social Justice Assessment Project that involves all of those partner organizations. Most of them are student services, student affairs organizations, but it also includes the Association for the Assessment of Learning in Higher Education. And we continue to have these conversations about how we do this work and how do we think about equitable assessment, equity-driven assessment to do a better job on our campus. Eric and Natasha created an update that I think just came out just in January or February to really kind of lay the groundwork for what's been happening since they published the paper 2 years earlier. And so if you want to really get an update on what's happening and just get a lay of the land, this NILO update occasional paper is an excellent to take a look at. So first of all, we want to talk a little bit and just acknowledge there are a lot of different terms. You know, we don't have the time in this short webinar to really deconstruct and unpack each of these terms, but we do want to say that, acknowledge there are different terms that are being used, and it's not even clear right now in the field and what even terms we should be using this. Ann and I have been talking about socially just assessment. Natasha and Eric have been talking about culturally responsive. There's emerging conversation about equity-minded assessment, equity-driven assessment, assessment for equity. And so there's still it's evolving. And so we're continuing to have conversations with folks about what are the best terminology, what's most appropriate. And I suspect that will even shift over time as new terms come about and our understanding of the terms change. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, Ann and I talked a little bit about what does this look like or what could this look like beyond culturally responsive assessment. And so we actually put together this continuum that's been really kind of driving some of our work and our thought processes around this topic. We don't have the opportunity to go in detail about this, but we've published this work and talked a little bit about it in multiple places. So you can go back to those and take a look to get a little bit more understanding for each one of these. But really the whole point is to move our assessment processes from the point of where we're stopping causing harm. So really thinking about our assessment in a way that how do we stop perpetuating systems of power and oppression, moving through towards bias-free assessment, and then thinking about how do we do assessment in a socially just manner, but then also thinking about how do we actually use assessment as a field, as a vehicle for social justice and decolonization. And so some of our other work has really kind of talked about each one of those elements and probably broken down a little bit more. But we really focus this webinar really about the how-to and the strategies. And if you really want to think about equity-minded assessment, what are some things that you can be doing? And the first thing you really have to think about is really assessment is not just a practice that really just kind of sits by itself. It's actually it's impacted, it sits within the social and political positions within our institutions. And so it really requires us to take some thought and reflection about how is assessment being used for good, but how are we actually maybe using assessment in ways that actually continue to cause harm? And really thinking about the socio-political positions for assessment. And typically we really thought about talking about assessment and diversity and equity separately. And we've done this partly because of the way those two fields evolved. Diversity, equity, and inclusion started as kind of a standalone because we really needed to elevate that topic within higher education. That's when offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion were started. And at the beginning of that, diversity and equity work was really just the responsibility of the people responsible for that. And now we've actually realized that everybody needs to be doing that. Assessment evolved the same way, that to really highlight the importance of assessment, that was really made a person's job. There's offices are created, but now we realize that assessment should be done by everybody. And unfortunately, those two concepts have been kept separate up until this point. And we're really trying to think about how do we move those closer to each other. Then I'll pass it on to Ann to talk a little bit about the landscape in higher education.
All right, great. Thanks, Gavin. Yeah, so as Gavin mentioned, those separate fields or bubbles, they have separate scholarship. They often, it's discrete practitioners, right? So my background in field is more in assessment work, and my growing edge is around diversity, equity, inclusion work. And I have a lot of colleagues that I look to for that. But in the assessment landscape, as Gavin mentioned, it's gotten much more top of mind for most people in higher education due to some of the reasons that we've listed out here. You know, a lot of the changing student demographics have driven assessment work. Clearly, we're all aware of the external accountability factors. And fortunately, the increased emphasis on student learning outcomes assessment. And then this idea of how we actually help students develop skills that are going to be useful to them post-graduation. And then that larger assessment conversation around not just year-end reporting of outcomes and metrics, but real data that we can get our hands around in an ongoing way for continuous improvement, particularly related to student success of all students, and for students or campuses to be able to use those insights for nuanced analyses. And then in the diversity, equity, inclusion landscape, we have some similar sorts of things that have emerged in the last few years or so, including the changing demographic, you know, the population of students on our campus, and the clear work that has been done in the assessment world around the access disparities and the opportunity in graduation for various populations of students. We, as Gavin mentioned, there's been this, in a good way, the rise of the chief diversity officer, so increased focus and awareness and attention. And at the same time, we know that some of the systemic issues on our campuses and the policies, procedures that we have not changed. And so those structures are still there. So there's a lot of work to be done around inclusive campus climate, support services for underrepresented students. So that's kind of the landscape that we're coming into this with. Ben Simone has done a lot of work around equity, and you know, acknowledges that the idea of equity, it seems to be everywhere right now, and is not as marginalized of a concept, but as we are well aware, the actual embodiment of equity, we have a lot of work to do in higher education. We did a little survey just a year ago or so to kind of, this is more student affairs practitioners, just to ask about if these worlds are coming together in their work. So the equity, diversity, inclusion practices and the assessment practices. And we find that with the survey respondents who were for the most part student affairs assessment practitioners, you know, about half of them or so are seeing that emerge. But for senior leadership, at least their perception is that it's not as important to senior leadership. And I think the question about students, and we'll get at this in a minute, people were maybe even just confused by the question, what do you mean, does this matter to students? We'll talk a little bit about how and why that would be important. Another question we asked them were about their practices. So a couple of ways, and we're going to highlight more as we go here, that people are bringing those two worlds together is assessment practitioners or offices working with diversity, equity, and inclusion experts and practitioners to think about demographic questions that are current and inclusive, including students in the design of learning outcome statements, disaggregating data by student population to better understand those various populations, and using multiple methods. So we'll explore some of these in a little bit, but these are just some ways that folks are working to bring these worlds together. I think, you know, right now, the driver in part is this changing demographic issue, the idea about the focus of campuses on diversity and student success and retention and persistence and graduation and what that looks like. I think that can be a place where there's common and shared interests. And we're starting to see examples, I think, coming out in the field where in the authentic drive towards student success, people are thinking about how assessment can be leveraged to enhance and promote that. There's a recent report that's come out again by NILOA about trending practices that document authentic student learning and the role that assessment plays. And one of the highlights of this piece is assessment continues to be driven by both compliance and improvement, and with an emphasis on equity. So those things don't have to be mutually exclusive. And I think campuses are trying to figure out how to do both of those, and that equity is as important, if not more important value than the external accountability movement that has driven assessment for so long. And then in this larger context, a lot of us who are assessment practitioners are used to this idea of an assessment cycle that you see in the center of this slide. We identify our outcomes, we think about the methods, we deliver our programs and services, we collect data, we analyze, interpret it, we share the results. Now, even in the assessment world, we tend to be a little stronger on the data collection part, jumping in the middle of the assessment cycle, maybe not as conscious or aware of the choices at the front end. And certainly we can be held accountable for not always sharing and using the results for action and change. But when we position that assessment cycle in the context of this larger conversation, we want to think about things like societal culture and the role and the position and the power of the assessor or the assessment practice, and then use that and the practices that we'll think about in the assessment process to drive not only institutional effectiveness, but also improve and promote student learning and make an impact on our societal culture writ large. So part of what that means is, and we'll talk about this also with a few more ideas at the end, is really just some reframing for ourselves, especially as assessment practitioners, and really thinking about the ways that we're including social justice in all pieces of our work. As Brian Bork says, not just a hat we wear when called upon or when we turn our diversity lens on, but that it's really should be embedded in everything that we do and in all choices that we make. And hopefully, and we've got some examples of this to share with you today, as this conversation continues to evolve, part of that reframing is maybe thinking of assessment more as inquiry, so things that we don't know or understand and the ways that we want to go about finding that out, and diversity, equity, inclusion work as equity. So these bubbles now can start to have shared interests, and the practices that come out of that will lead to some authentic change on our campuses.
If we actually talk about how we do this, we kind of take a few steps back and talk about culture and paradigms, because as we mentioned, assessment sits within these socio-political spheres and in these organizations that we all work in. And so we really have to kind of understand and kind of deconstruct some of those situations. And so the first thing is about culture. So culture is behavior, language, symbols, attitudes that really define an organization. And in higher education, even a college or university has multiple cultures. It could be a culture at the department level, at the program level, at the division level, at the institutional level, and then even the institutions sit within geographic areas, municipalities, and all those cultures can be a little bit different. But the thing we really want to talk about and acknowledge for this conversation are those systems of power and oppression that underlie all of those cultures, all of those behaviors, the language, symbols, and attitudes. These systems of power and oppression, patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity, cisgenderism, other isms, we can go on and on with a whole list of these different systems. They influence the behaviors, language, and symbols and the way we do things within higher education. Just everything we do, not just assessment. And with this under the surface, we don't necessarily are paying attention to them. And unless we acknowledge them and really consider them all the time, they're going to influence our work. And we have to really think through what are those systems of power and oppression, and how might we be able to use assessment to dismantle some of those. And so we're going to talk a little bit about acknowledging these systems, but then through assessment, but then using assessment to actually make some change. And research and assessment is really about this a paradigm, and a paradigm typically has these 4 different areas. Ontology is really this understanding of what is real. How do we know what's real? And, you know, for our assessment work, how do we know what that assessment work really is? Epistemology is how do we know that? Really the creation of knowledge. How do we create assessment data and that seems to be help us understand what's going on and accurately helps us understand what's happening. Methodology are just the tools and processes for us to gather that data, that information, to really know what reality is. And axiology are really the ethics that guide their work. Not just the ethics in the typical way, but really what types of things do we privilege in this process? What methods do we privilege? What types of data do we privilege? What types of reality do we privilege? Whose reality do we privilege? That's all part of the ethics piece. And so really we really want to talk a little bit about these paradigms because paradigms have an impact on how we actually do assessment. So we really need to understand both this, this culture that underlies our colleges and universities, you know, the work that we do, our philosophical paradigms that we bring to this individually, and the foundational assumptions of assessment. And so assessment has really been built on this more positivist perspective where we needed to be objective. The knower needed to be separate from the knowing. But we realize that that's not possible. There's no way to be objective. And in many ways, when we try to do that, whoever the assessment person is, the researcher, their vision is really still imposed on what's happening. And given that most of the people doing assessment are still white, coming from privileged identities, we really need to think about that and think really about our role. And as you know, as we talked about, assessment had really kind of started in this positive perspective, and still quantitative data is privileged and over others. People think quantitative data is better, more reliable, more effective. I think part of this is because assessment is about creating evidence for decision making, and a lot of decision makers prefer quantitative data because it's easier to digest, it's easier to read, review. But those data don't tell the whole story. Qualitative data can really help us understand what's happening, and those two types of data together can give us a fuller perspective. But we need to really understand that some of this data is privileged over others. And as I mentioned, the assessment started with this idea that the knower had to be separate from the known. And that's problematic because we really need to think about how we all construct knowledge, how we all interpret knowledge, because each of us interpret information differently. We interpret the world differently. We interpret our practices differently. And to really understand what's happening, to really understand students' experience and how our work affects their experience, we really need to gather some data that helps us understand that in a more holistic way. And really just thinking about assessment as social justice, as a vehicle for social justice, we really need to understand students' experience, but really understand that their experiences are affected by these systems of power and oppression. I think we're realizing this more now than we ever have before. And we need to uncover and examine those biases in those systems of power and oppression, because that can continue to perpetuate those systems. We really need to think about how do we gather data in a more culturally responsive way and do assessment that's more socially just. And shifting assessment from this transactional practice where we just gather data to make change, which is beneficial, but to how do we use assessment to transform these systems of power and oppression? But we need to use assessment to expose those first. We need to understand what they are, how they operate, before we can actually make change. So that's really kind of the foundational elements that we're talking about. You know, so we need to understand that piece of it before we move on to the strategies and how to really put this in practice. Mm-hmm. And we love this quote because it really helps us think about that. We really have been doing assessment in non-justice thinking ways, and that really does some damage. It does damages to individual students, and it does damages to our institutions. So we really need to apply the social justice lens, this equity lens, to the work that we're doing, and always think about how we do assessment and how does equity interact with that? How does equity overlay that? Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna pass it over to Anne to talk a little bit about social justice around the assessment cycle.
Thanks, Gavin. So I think that the context is so important, and we'll come back to our assessment cycle here for a moment. And again, we tend to separate these things out, but this is one way, and part of this way of thinking comes out of some work that C.G. Heiser and Krista Prince and Joe Levy did, and when they wrote a piece about applying critical theory to assessment work, particularly in student affairs, but I think this is applicable more broadly. And this idea of sort of, if you're thinking about the ways that those two bubbles can come together, not thinking of the assessment cycle as a standalone process, but about positionality and power and agency and voice and diversity of methods, all throughout the entire assessment cycle. So we'll kind of unpack that here for a minute with a couple of specific examples, and we'll start with the identifying outcomes. And that's ideally in an assessment practice, the first thing we do is we think about what the expected outcomes are. And we know that those are not always neutral. In fact, I love this piece by Jan MacArthur, because she talks about, in a lot of times, especially in the curriculum, the learning outcomes are decided upon sort of by committee and maybe at the institutional level, then they're passed down. So if I'm an individual instructor and I'm looking at what I want the outcomes to be for my course, I may be a little bit hamstrung in terms of what those expectations are. It partly requires a conversation on campus about back to that, what is reality, what is expected and what constitutes learning. So how do students even demonstrate the learning and therefore know what the outcome is. We also probably need to do a better job of evaluating the language that we use in our student learning outcome statements for bias and cultural assumptions, relevance to various student populations. They could be reflecting this unacknowledged sort of average student and not speak to many of the students that are actually on our campus. And that requires us to involve multiple stakeholders to really, to get a sense of that. And it does include including students in the writing of the learning outcome statement. So helping them to bring voice to their own learning and how they're going to demonstrate it. We have a quote from that first piece by Eric and Natasha. When we include students, if we write learning outcome statements for and with our students, we also increase the chance that students understand what's expected of them. And in addition, instead of students' knowledge conforming to how we traditionally measure it, students would now have agency in how to demonstrate their learning. So we're thinking of assessment, again, as a way to increase the students' agency in the learning and assessment process. One of the other things is that many of us assessment folks are pretty used to using our Bloom's taxonomy. And even though we know that there are some non-cognitive verbs in the hierarchical Bloom's taxonomy, if you look at the list of verbs for these, we tend to think in a linear progression. The language of the verbs themselves may be non-inclusive. And so a piece that we've been looking at, I think on the next slide here, Gavin, is by Marcella Lefevre. She's written a piece called Switching from Bloom to the Medicine Wheel. So this is thinking about Indigenous ways of knowing as an example, and creating learning outcomes that support those ways of knowing in post-secondary education. So on the next slide, there's an example here of one of the domains, the spiritual domain, and she just explicates what some sample verbs might be and that progression for creating outcome statements, moving from honoring to self-actualization, which is a different way of thinking about it. And even when we look at the verbs like honoring or seeking or speaking out about, there's some verbs that don't show up in our Bloom's taxonomy that really may be the kind of learning that students are invested in, and it's authentic and meaningful to them. So then the next piece in our cycle is really about not just the framing of the outcome statements and the desired learning, but the conversations about stakeholders about like just what constitutes learning and what counts as credible evidence. So that may be a place where you can start, is by just having that conversation on your campus. And then another piece or a step in our assessment cycle, once we've got that framework of the outcomes articulated, we collect assessment data. And as Hood, Hobson, and Kirkhart say, beyond the tools or instruments themselves, the procedures, as Gavin mentioned, surrounding their use must also be responsive to the cultural context. And this is for qualitative, quantitative data, but we really need to go underneath that iceberg and think about whether we're having just sort of a knee-jerk response to the way we want to collect data, or if we've really been thoughtful in our data collection analysis. So one way is to reprioritize the use of qualitative data. As our colleague Patrick Biddix from Tennessee mentions, this can help us enlighten experiences of students, explore issues that we don't have any real understanding of, reveal these processes that we were even unaware that there was even an issue or a problem. It can map the learning environment for students and examine very complex issues that quantitative data just can't do. It's also constructivist in the approach, so it's this co-creating of reality. One of the other things that we think about, as a qualitative method is something like a focus group. So we tend to, again, that knower in the known, we tend to say, I'm going to create my protocol, I'm going to conduct the focus group, analyze the data. It's very like separatist way of thinking about it. Elena Winters at Heartland Community College gives this idea of a talking circle or a conversation circle, where if you look at the cycle here, that is a conversation with and maybe among students or staff, there could be collection of assessment data is embedded within the building of trust and relationships. It's not separated out. And the experience of the conversation is actually beneficial to the participants at the moment of the conversation, and the assessment data is also collected and able to be shared. So it's this less separate way of looking at it. And then the other thing is there's an idea of using competency-based rubrics. So a rubric can be something where, especially if we include students in the process of creating the rubric, we parse out the domains, we think about what constitutes learning at various levels. And then it also sets clear expectations so students are aware of the why behind the learning environment, and they can participate in the articulation of that, as well as get feedback. So the actual use of the rubric tool is not just an assessment instrument that's done to students, but it's also participatory. And just like rubrics, also the use of portfolios is another example. This really does help students get to choose often, bring forward the work that resonates with them. They have agency in selecting what they want to showcase that demonstrates that they've achieved the outcome. So this is not just a one-size-fits-all example, but a portfolio is another approach that it seems very equitable. Those assessment approaches and processes can help reinforce a sense of belonging for students, or add to the belief that they don't belong because their learning or their experiences are not deemed as valid as important. So when we do assessment, we're signaling to students what matters in the way we frame a question, in the processes and procedures we use, and in the ways that we allow them to demonstrate their learning. So a few tips here for methods, as Gavin and I mentioned at the outset, always thinking about power, positionality, and identity when you are the person who's conducting the assessment project. Consider how the methods might privilege certain types of information and therefore certain students. Think about the socio-historic aspects of the institution and the community and the student experience and how that's going to inform the analysis. Think about using authentic and embedded, like the talking circle, conversation circle, portfolios, those kinds of methods that are authentic and embedded. From the universal design, thinking about allowing students options for demonstrating their learning, and multiple methods of data collection. So if we are going to collect quantitative data, can we augment that with qualitative data that enhances and informs it? And always thinking about how we can involve students in the data collection process.
It's also important to think about analysis, interpretation of data, and doing that with an equity lens, because data don't speak for themselves. They're given voice by somebody, and either the assessment people is interpreting them or somebody else is doing that interpretation. So we have the responsibility to think about whose voices are shared, and when we talk about analysis of data, not just when we're sharing the data, but in the analysis process. And so we think it's necessary to do disaggregation by student population. We really need to understand how learning is different for student populations, how experiences are different by different student populations. But that can't be enough, because what disaggregation can do sometimes is actually put everybody into homogeneous groups. And so, even when we take a look at Black or African-American students, not all of their experiences are going to be the same. I actually have a doctoral student who's looking at the difference in cultural differences between African-American Black students and African immigrant students, and how we've really just put all those students together as Black, but their experiences are distinctly different. And so we need to keep that in mind. So disaggregation is necessary, but not sufficient. We need to really make sure we don't fall into that trap of homogeneity within each of these groups. And so we really think about, so what are the benefits of aggregating data and the benefits of disaggregating data? So really looking at why would we aggregate data? And we want to do that. Again, as Ann said, we're looking at create the fullest picture possible. So we do want to look at the whole, but we also want to look at the parts of that whole as well, because they all tell a little bit different story. We can't help all the students unless we know how different groups of students are impacted. And here's some other things to really think about in terms of demographic questions. So that really starts with, how do we understand things? So not only, as Ann said, can the data help us really kind of break down things, but data, the questions in the format and even the demographic options we provide tell a story, and they signal something to students about their value. And so we really need to think about, what is our purpose in this? We want to be able to provide an accurate description of the sample. And so if your gender is male and female, and that's it, that's not, well, first of all, it's not even gender, those are sexual terms, but it's really not holistic of your student population. Adding another is better, but that's not sufficient either. And so students who may not identify on that gender binary will not see themselves in that, will not feel valued. And so that has implications, as Ann said, about sense of belonging and connection to the institution. And then that obviously has impact on what they learn and what they experience in their student success. And so really thinking about, how do we communicate values of inclusion with the responses that we do, but still balancing that with the need to be able to gather data in a way to break things up. One option is let students identify themselves. That's probably the most inclusive, but from a way to disaggregate the data, that's really challenging, especially when you're looking at data from 1,000, 10,000, 30,000 students. That's hard to do. And so we really need to think about, how do we balance both of those and be able to help us describe our sample, help us think through our analysis and how can we disaggregate the data, but still helping students be able to define themselves, describe themselves in ways that feel real and authentic, and really value that. And the University of Arizona has actually given, in their Division for Student Affairs and Enrollment Management has done some work around that. And you can actually find this guide on the internet, so if you want to just do a quick quick link for that. And some professional organizations are having these conversations about what demographic options should be available, and maybe that changes for different data collection methods. Sometimes you can connect to institutional databases, which could be limiting, but there's some other ways where the group is small and you can actually have students really just simply self-identify in an open-ended option. And we also want to really highlight this idea about analyzing small populations. Some of the common rhetoric is that if a number is too small, if that N is too small, it's not valuable. Ann and I believe there are powers in small numbers, because even if you have a small group of students on your campus, their voice matters, their experience matters. On my campus, if we have, let's say I'm a small campus, about 1,500 undergraduates, if I've only got 4 Native American students, I'm not going to disregard that group of students because their N is too small. In actuality, their sample is the entire population. And so we really need to acknowledge that and understand those experiences, not discount them because they may not be generalizable across the entire population. Those small samples may be your whole population. And so even response from 2 students can be telling. But that helps us think through what other data collection methods may we need. So a quantitative approach may not be helpful with small populations. We may need to reach out with interviews or focus groups to really fully understand that. Here are a few tips regarding analysis interpretation. So really give voice to data through reflection. We need to think about our own positionality, our own biases, what we bring to this, and how our voice, it becomes the voice or influences the voice of those data. Engage multiple stakeholders. Involve students in the process. Involving students in the process, involving students at every step of the assessment process is valuable. They bring interesting perspectives, they bring things we wouldn't normally think about, and they can help interpret the data in ways that us adults aren't able to do. Triangulate data with multiple data sources and multiple perspectives. That helps us understand a full picture of what's going on, at least a fuller picture of what's going on. And then disaggregate data, but don't fall into that reductionist approach that every person in that one group is the same. And And then just really thinking about the ways that data are analyzed and interpreted really has some impact for what's happening. It can be problematic and limit the understandings of some of these marginalized groups. If we want everybody to succeed in our colleges and universities, we need to think about the negative impacts of some of our methods and some of our both data collection and analysis methods. And how do we do that in a more inclusive way? I'm going to pass it over to Ann to talk a little bit more in detail about inclusive assessment.
Yeah, so I think we've mentioned some examples, and there's many, many more, and more are emerging all the time, but this kind of just summarizes it throughout that entire assessment cycle. If we think about our own positionality and subjectivity, and also all the folks that are involved in the assessment project itself, agency and voice of all the different stakeholders throughout the process, including and especially students, being really open to methodological diversity, thinking about, as Gavin mentioned, it's, you know, what is the purpose of this particular assessment project, and what is the question that we're actually trying to answer, and that will drive and inform some of these choices for us. And really, where does power live and lie throughout the whole process, and acknowledging our own power or lack thereof in various assessment and data collection projects. We can learn from quite a lot of other fields outside of the assessment field. One of those is universal design for learning, and often in a teaching and learning center on your campus, you probably have some experts in this area. But universal design really takes into account the impact of the environment and emotion on learning. So our ability to learn is impacted by that, it acknowledges it. And it individualizes learning for all students, and again, giving options for students to demonstrate their learning so it doesn't all have to look the same. And this idea of embedded assessment is part of universal design. So the feedback to the student, which is a form of assessment, is intrinsic and relevant and immediate and continuous. It's not saved for the end, like at the end of the learning experience. And the assessment is embedded so that shortens the time between the learning and the feedback. And another place where we can really all learn and grow is from Indigenous research methods and scholarship. There's a link on this slide to a reading list with lots of resources. A few are, we have the images on the slide here. The book that I think Gavin and I both started out reading here is Sean Wilson's Research is Ceremony. So it's actually his PhD dissertation, and he explicates not only the process of thinking about himself in the landscape of the institution in which he's trying to conduct his research for his PhD. So he breaks that apart and down, so he sort of unpacks the structures and then he brings his own lens to it and talks about power and agency and voice throughout that. So I think it's a really good way in for folks who are unfamiliar with Indigenous research methods. And then we can really, I know for me, I've been learning a lot as I listen to and read and seek to understand Indigenous paradigms, which are radically different from my own Western, white, middle class, college educated view. Like, it's just a different, I know that is deeply embedded within me. And I tend to have that knower in the known as my response to collecting data or thinking about things. So in this Indigenous paradigm, there's less of that separatism. There's more connection between Earth, the cosmos, myself, my community. Knowledge is relational and shared. It's not, I own the knowledge and I have to cite it and keep it from you. And therefore, if knowledge is relational and shared, it can't be owned or it can't be discovered. And equity and equality and inclusion is just embedded within everything. It's not a separate thing that we need to think about. So this is something that I've been spending energy trying to learn more about. And then Jan MacArthur points out again that to be genuinely inclusive of all students requires more than simply their greater involvement in the assessment process, although we've, mentioned the ways why that is really important. It really does start with us requiring a questioning of really taken for granted assumptions about the nature and purpose of assessment itself. And this is a huge challenge for us. It's an embedded structure. So this idea of fairness through assumed sameness is pervasive in our society. We're seeing evidence of that right now, and within our assessment practices. So reforming assessment is going to involve changing not simply our assessment practices, but how we understand our role as assessors and how we understand our relationships with our students. And then Jillian Kinsey was just the keynote at the New England College's assessment conference, and she did a keynote address on this, which I think is recorded and available. But I really appreciated her thoughts here, and she said, among many other things, addressing issues of equity may involve some uncomfortable, challenging, and courageous conversations and discussions. And equity data informed discussions have the power to foster progress. So these are going to be challenging conversations, but I think they will lead to change that is necessary. So just to kind of sum things up here as we wrap up, we've mentioned a lot of things throughout this, but really if we sort of a takeaway is that all these aspects of culture, that our individual awareness about ourselves and our role and the action that we can take, and the organizational commitment and accountability of the place where we are currently working, those all have an impact on our ability to impact socially just assessment or to carry it out or to leverage it. So I think the starting place, as with all things, is to start with ourselves. And failing to be aware of our own biases or subconscious ideas may cause the assessment endeavor to implement outdated norms as a means of comparison, like Gavin mentioned, which can misclassify certain students as underachievers or confusing, or the term we use in assessment, the outlier, and can also lead to the mistake of failing to connect the data to the actual lived experiences and realities of the student institutions served. So if we don't examine ourselves, just by default, we're going to be carrying out some of these harm-causing practices, and we're certainly not going to be advancing equity. And really throughout the entire assessment process, one of the main things that we can do if we are the person conducting the assessment is to really reflect on and articulate for ourselves positionality, agency, and power. So have these be top of mind questions, and that will change with different assessment projects or different roles that you might play within an institution, or as Gavin mentioned, if it's departmental work or institutional work, these are not static. These are fluid, so we always have to be reflecting on this. And then just considering, are we promoting unconsidered inquiry through not being aware? So those cultural and contextual historical factors that we mentioned at the beginning of the place where we're actually working now, the various forms of oppression that Gavin mentioned, and the structures, and are we just ignoring those and saying, well, these are part of this assessment topic, so they're not relevant here? These assumptions of homogeneity. As Gavin was talking about disaggregation of data, this is a very weedy subject because there's much literature around multiple versus singular theories. So ways of knowing, evidence, and intersectionality. And so, when we classify a student or they even self-identify, we know that that is still a reduction to a data point as opposed to the reflection of a whole human being. And then how and where are we raising up marginalized voices or silencing them? So as Gavin mentioned, if we think about moving assessment from just a transaction that we are carrying out to a transformation, we can explore and engage our own worldview, biases, and cultural assumptions, really be open to thinking about who decides and who benefits from the assessment. So this is a question of power. Confronting ourselves and probably others in some of those courageous conversations around procedures and methods, considering how value is attached to what is measured and having that conversation, discussing and critiquing how meaning is attached to the data and the results, so that's that analysis piece, and recognizing and addressing the extent to which assessment work prevents social justice and structural transformation. So is the assessment itself actually just shoring up the status quo that is having that negative impact and is not advancing equity? And that's where some of those difficult conversations may have to take place. So that's more of an organizational question. And again, we don't have time to delve into this, but this is just one model from the National Gender and Equity Campaign. But we know that institutions are in various places and you know, from their awareness, their own awareness about how open and willing they are to discuss new frameworks or gain new knowledge or, you know, really confront those paradigms. Whether they're being intentional or strategic about that, or whether they've worked towards embedding that throughout and across. So wherever your work is, helping to understand that context, and then also what your role can be in working on that. And so I think, you know, the last piece is thinking, if I'm thinking of myself and my own power and positionality, I'm working on my own awareness, I'm working on exploring my own biases and my own power, where can I make an organizational impact? I may not be able to dismantle the entire structures at the institutional level, but I may be able to just focus initially on my own readiness to engage in the assessment work and the diversity, equity, inclusion work. And I may be able to make a very direct impact in the programs or even the activities, the workshops, the courses where I teach. How can I bring this lens to that space? And then again, be able to facilitate potentially up through the organization and to other conversations with other colleagues. And also listen and learn from those who have voice to share information that is new and different from our own. And I think that's where the higher education community impact is happening now. We're starting to see examples and case studies and different frameworks emerging. So the more we bring those out so that others can have access to them, the more of an opportunity we'll have for organizational and higher education change. So assessment in higher education, we believe, along with Paskett, Carducci, Kuntz, and Gildersleeve, is uniquely positioned to transform inquiry as a more inclusive practice in pursuit of equity, because we can draw on that wealth of scholarly traditions in order to critique the status quo, integrate power, theorize agency, and work towards social justice. So hopefully through this, you can see from our conversation here how we think that conversation is continuing to evolve, that the inquiry equity conversation is coming maybe a little closer together, a little more overlap and integration happening. And we want to share with you a few resources here at the end, just for you to continue to grow your own knowledge. Of course, this whole conference is dedicated to this topic, so I'm excited to learn from others and hear their voices. And there was this fall issue dedicated to this, so if you want to go back and do some reading on that in the AAHLE intersection. With Campus Labs, we have a web page dedicated to socially just assessment, and on that is the results of the survey we did. We have a podcast series where Gavin and I facilitated conversations with a lot of leaders in the field here, and really great conversations where we learned a lot, so you might enjoy that. And then as a part of that, there was also some webinars that are posted up there. So this will just make some starting places if you want to continue your own knowledge or share with others. The Journal of Student Affairs Inquiry in 2017 dedicated its entire issue to advancing social justice via student affairs inquiry. So this has some great articles and examples. We also have, one of those is this one we mentioned earlier by Heiser, Prince, and Levy about applying a critical theory lens to student affairs assessment. So they really unpack how to do that, or a way to think about that to advance equity. And then the Association for Institutional Research published an entire volume in 2018 on assessment and social justice. So again, we're thinking about the institutional lens, the student affairs lens, the classroom-based lens. So these are all the different places where we work and practice. And then we are continuing at Campus Labs just to look for other places. So we've got a lot of additional work and podcasts and series that are on our website as well. And then all the references we have in this slide and at the end here. So we encourage you to look at those and also share. Gavin and I are always, usually after one of these conversations, we have really fantastic folks come forward with things that we don't know anything about, and we continue to grow our list of resources, and so we're happy to continue to receive those from you and also share them as this conversation evolves. Anything else you want to mention, Gavin, here at the end?
The only thing I'd mention is that, when we have these conversations with folks or do presentations, we have people come up and say, this sounds great, but it's just really overwhelming. And it can be. There's a lot of new knowledge, especially if you don't feel ready to do socially just work. Ann and I think we continue to do our own work, but we are far from being where we should be or where we want to be. But I think our philosophy is a little is better than none. Right. So even just putting an equity lens on what's happening, just thinking about, is this an inclusive process? That's right. Better than not at all. Like Ann said, you may not have the power to dismantle the whole system, but can you learn on your own? So when you do assessment even of your programs, of your own activities, you do that in an equitable way. And if you do that, you might be able to share that with some colleagues. And so some is better than none. Even just starting to read is a good place to start. So try not to be overwhelmed because, again, everybody can have a part in this and make some change, even on a very small level.
That's great.
Well, thank you for joining us. Hopefully you found the information useful. Check out some of the resources. Ann and I are always happy to chat as well. We should have included our email addresses, but if you did a quick internet search, you can find our contact information pretty quickly. You can find mine on the New England College directory website, and I can easily connect you with Ann's email as well. And so we're happy to always continue the conversation. We've learned from each other and learned from all other folks when they bring in new topics and new ideas. And this really has to be a collaborative, inclusive approach if we really want to make change. So thank you very much for joining us and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.